Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Center for Economic Inclusion's Reckoning to Rise series. We're thrilled to be back with you all, thrilled to be back in our Reckoning to Rise series for fall. It's been a short hiatus since our series began not last year, actually in January of this year. And we are thrilled to have so many of you back with us for this fall series and our opportunity to gather together again to continue our reckoning with racism in our economy and our reckoning with our opportunities to build regional economies across this country that truly work for everyone. Today, like every time we gather, we have a team of speakers who are doing this work in their own spheres of influence and their own spheres of impact, who are going to share with us their own tools, solutions, ideas, and data for building regional economies that work for everyone, workplaces and workforces that are racially equitable, inclusive, the tools and solutions that they have identified and are using with employers and with job seekers in order to build businesses and communities that are not only equitable, but also that advance good jobs and what it takes to be able to do this at scale. We're excited for today's conversation. We're excited to be able to have you all in that dialogue with us and the opportunity for us to really build together and realize economies that are working for all of us. We want to move forward into our next opportunity here to be able to ensure that we're moving forward and you are promoting this on your own social media channels now. And so be sure that you're sharing this with others. Here are our social handles at Econ Inclusion on Twitter and on Facebook and on Instagram, on LinkedIn as well. Please be sure that you are also promoting and sharing tweets and conversations from our speakers. We want to be in dialogue with you, not only today during the conversation, but after it as well, and want to continue this as much as we can. So please engage with us on social media with the hashtag Reckoning, the number 2, and Rise. Be sure that we're promoting that as much as we can and engaging in this dialogue, as well as the solutions and ideas that you might have for how we can continue to build workplaces and a workforce that is equitable and inclusive. We want to keep this going in as many places and spaces as we can. And as always, we want you to be taking advantage of lunch from those vendors in our community who represent our Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Latinx communities. So we hope that you've already gone to our website and visited some of these vendors. You've ordered lunch using a number of different vehicles that would represent how to purchase lunch in your neighborhood, or maybe you stopped by and picked up lunch, but we want to pick up that tagline. If we don't buy local, we will be saying goodbye to local vendors. So please take an opportunity now, if you haven't already, and purchase lunch from one of these vendors. We have loved hearing your stories all summer from folks who have been buying not just lunch, but also dinner and stopping by for date nights from many of these vendors. And it's been great to hear from them just how meaningful it is when we're all purchasing from them. So thank you for what you've done. We also want to encourage you, if you're doing your team retreats, if you're taking time out for team events, or maybe you're hosting events like this in person, think about these vendors, purchase from them, engage them for your catering as well. And if you know about other vendors that we should have on this list, please email our team so that we can get them added to this list. We want to continue spreading the good word about businesses in our community who we can all be sharing the love with, so we can include and ensure they continue to grow and prosper in our economy. We want to make sure that we know a bit about who is in the room, and we know how you are continuing to drive impact. And we know some folks are continuing to come into the room now, but we're going to do a little bit of polling to help us know not only who's here, but what you have been doing with the knowledge that you've been gaining while you've been coming to this Reckoning to Rise series. Have you been using that knowledge? I hope that you have been, because this is not only about us coming together and fellowshipping together and reckoning together. It's also about what we do with what we learn after we leave these series each month together. So we want to encourage you. Take a moment now. You should see a poll on your screens that's asking you a few questions. We want to know who's in the room from a racial identity perspective, from a generational perspective, and an age perspective. We want to know who's in the room from a gender identity perspective. We want to know if you've engaged in the center's events before in the past. And we want to know how you're using what you're learning in this space. If you have used what you've learned to develop new social capital, new relationships with folks that you may engage with in the chat space, or if you've been to our events face-to-face before, if you've built new relationships and you're catalyzing those relationships to drive change in our community, we want to know about that. If you've used what you've learned to build new anti-racist workforce policies, practices, or strategies, we want to know about that. Maybe you've used what you've learned here from our speakers or our team here at the center to build new supplier diversity policies, practices, or strategies. We'd love to know that. Maybe you're someone out there in a foundation or a corporate grant making program, and you're using what you've learned in order to drive change in the philanthropic spaces. We'd love to hear about that, or perhaps maybe in the marketplace realm. We'd love to know that. Maybe you're learning things and you're applying it to our economic development sphere or workforce development policies and practices. We'd love to know that as well. We'd love to know how you're using what you're learning and gaining, and you haven't had an opportunity. We'd love to hear that. I see in the chat that if this is your first event, there isn't an option there, and forgive us, that is a good catch and a flaw in this polling opportunity, and we'll be sure that we get that corrected for this choice. If that is keeping you from being able to submit this, we'll work on an adaptation here so that we make sure we can get that taken care of and you can complete this poll. Thank you for giving us that feedback, Carrie, in the chat here. We'll get that solved for, but we'd love to get your polling and responses here so that we could figure out this feedback, and appreciate that too, the double option here. We are catching a couple of flaws here, so we may get this poll adjusted for an ending question by the end of the wrap up here. Thank you all for that feedback for a couple of catches. Thank you. We'll give it a little more time for participation. Absolutely. Please use that chat function too for additional feedback. It's one of the great things about an institution like this and the social capital being built here is that we can apply the qualitative feedback to adapt our results here. So please, we encourage you to continue to use the chat function to give us additional feedback that will allow us to adapt here. Couple of moments. Okay, let's end our polling. Okay, so we can see our results here in terms of what our diversity is as we look at our first polling results. We've got some diversity across the audience, and yet some opportunity to continue to diversify our audience even more, because we want to be sure that we are fully representative of our audience across our metro area. So we look at both our racial diversity, our age diversity. We've got some good diversity across a number of generations, and yet an opportunity to continue reaching certainly our youngest generations, and yet great to see some of our oldest generations. And so we'll continue to diversify there. We've also got an opportunity to continue to diversify in our gender identities. We've got some diversity in terms of people who have been here. It's great to see 42% of our attendees that this is their first event attending. Welcome our newcomers. And yet great diversity across those who have attended 1 to 3 and up to 10% of folks who have attended more than 6 events. It's great to see as well. And in terms of the ways that people are using the knowledge gained from attending today's events, again, acknowledging that many of you would like to be able to submit having used this information in a number of different ways, but it's great to see here that 57% of people have used this knowledge in relationship building, which is one of the greatest ways that we can continue to drive anti-racism across our region is through those relationships, which is so important, in particular, those relationships across sectors and across our racial lines across our communities. And yet we also see a great impact across 16% who are focused on workforce policies and strategies and applying what's being learned here in that workforce space. We saw 12% who are driving change in economic development, workforce development policy, practice, or strategy, and a smaller number in supplier diversity or philanthropy at 7% and 6%, and an even smaller number at 2% in that marketplace realm. So some opportunity for us to drive greater impact in those spaces. And again, we'll update our polling to be able to get better data for those of you who might be drawing impact in more than one area so that we can really get this to be a little more scientific, but we'll certainly be gathering the input that you've given to us in terms of people who are driving impact in a number of areas. We really appreciate the feedback that you gave us today, folks. This is important for us, and we are contrasting this with feedback that if you came to our events in the past, those that were face-to-face, you know that we previously did polling, but we haven't been doing as much of that in this virtual world. And so we're going to go back and adopt that practice as we go into this event and our events in November and December, and are excited for that. I want to go into now sharing a little bit about the work, because we have such a large number of individuals who are here today for the first time. I want to give you some grounding as we prepare to go into our discussion with our speakers. If we could go to the next slide about the work of the Center for Economic Inclusion. We are an organization that is committed to helping leaders across sectors, but particularly in the public and private sectors, gain the tools and skills needed to build economies that work for everyone. Those abilities to be able to drive inclusive economic growth and competitiveness by centering racial equity. And if we could go to the next slide, we recognize that this is about our growth in cities across the country that for so long have been hindered by our inability to solve for inequities about race, place, and income. And our inability to solve for racism, our inability to undo racism in our communities is now impeding our ability to compete, not only for the best talent, the best companies, but our inability to really compete to be the best communities possible, communities where all people can thrive and where we want to be. All of us have the choice to live where we want to live, but we want those places to be places where everyone is welcome, where everyone experiences belonging. And here in Minnesota, where I live, some of you may be from communities all across the country, we're all wrestling with this question about what actions we have to wake up and do each and every day in our communities and neighborhoods and schools, and yes, at work, in order to truly foster equity, inclusion, and belonging. And at the center, our principal focus is on helping employers and government agencies and elected leaders determine and then take those actions and take them at scale in order to build economic inclusive growth by focusing on centering those very people who have been excluded from our economy's growth, by ensuring that when we do that, it's not only good for communities of color, but ultimately it is also good for our entire economy. Next slide, please. By taking these actions, we recognize through the data, we have an opportunity to close gaps for everyone, but we can't only focus on things like employment. We have to be very narrowly focused also on wage equity. And that is, yes, about workforce strategies and policies, like it showed the data in the data we just reviewed, a large percentage of you have been focused on, but also must be about strategies like investing in businesses owned by our Black, Indigenous, Asian, and Latinx communities, ensuring that those businesses have the tools and resources and investments necessary to grow and scale family-sustaining jobs. Next slide, please. Through these tools of changing those conditions of systems change, the conditions like our policies and practices, which is part of why we ask you about that, but also the conditions like resource flows, where dollars flow, how they flow, who receives dollars and access to those dollars, and what those dollars are positioned to be able to accomplish. Thinking about relationships and connections, who we have relationships with and how deep and meaningful those relationships are. Power dynamics, where power is held, how power is shared or transferred, how power determines what we know about how decisions are made, what decisions result in transferences of power or transferences of dollars that lead to transferences of wealth, and how that wealth leads to multi-generational changes in our economy and economic mobility. And lastly, mental models, how we think about one another, the roots of racism, the roots of power and economics. What we believe about one another across racial lines often determines those decisions we make about whether or not we invest in a person's business, whether or not we do business with a person of a different race or a person from a different community, a person from a different socioeconomic background, a person we just simply don't know. It takes us challenging those mental models, those things that we might have been taught to believe directly or might have been taught to believe in subtle ways. We take these things on and help business leaders and organizations start to understand how each one of these conditions are either set up to uphold inequities or repositioned to start to undo those inequities and truly create economies that work for everyone by having systems that work for everyone. Systems that are created and upheld and driven by each one of us within the powers and spheres of control that we have. This is the work of the Center for Economic Inclusion, but it's work that we do with people like you each and every day, because it requires each one of us choosing to take actions about equity and inclusion every day in our spheres, within the control that we have, within the influence that we have with one another. And that's the conversation that we're excited to be able to have today with our peers and friends. Next slide, please. These opportunities help us when we take them in earnest, working in the talent sphere, in policies around procurement, philanthropy, public policy in the government sphere, or thinking about the markets that we work in, the products and services we might sell if we're in a private sector environment, or areas of economic opportunity, jobs, housing, transportation, or transit. Each one of these ultimately lead to our ability to drive inclusive growth, to ensure that the communities we work and live in are prospering and that they're prospering in equitable ways, such that any neighborhood that we go to in whatever region we work and live in is prospering, that families and communities have an opportunity to prosper on their own terms, that those neighborhoods are vibrant in ways that are meaningful to the people who live in them. And they're able to write a story of economic prosperity and mobility, a story that reflects their own communities and their own values. That is the work of the Center for Economic Inclusion, and it's the work that I know you value as well. And that work takes each one of us being willing to act in solidarity, to write a new story of prosperity that is shared, one that requires each one of us working towards economic prosperity and mobility together. Now, I'm excited to be able to introduce our first speaker, who is going to lead us in this work, sharing the work of the McKinsey & Company, global marketing and sales practice, and the Black economic mobility practice at McKinsey & Company. Shelley is a leader at McKinsey & Company, but more than that, is the leader who has been introducing a new body of work over the last 2 years. We first introduced this work here on our platform in January of 2020, work that has excited the country really, and starting to understand what the economic imperative of closing racial wealth gaps is for the entire economy. Shelley leads the McKinsey Institute for Black Economic Mobility, a think and do tank, not unlike the Center for Economic Inclusion, focused on catalyzing solutions to improving economic outcomes for Black individuals and families. He has published numerous articles. The media widely covers his work, and he is a noted speaker on this topic. Shelley is on the board of directors of the National Black MBA Association, a nonprofit supporting 15,000 members with career placement and development. And he is also serving on the board of the Brooklyn Community Foundation, the first and only public foundation solely dedicated to Brooklyn's charitable community. Before joining McKinsey, Shelley worked on the financial services industry. He has a BA in economics from Boston College, an MBA from Columbia University, and an MPA from Harvard University. And I'm thrilled to welcome him to Reckoning to Rise. Welcome, Shelley.
Thank you, Tawanna, and thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I think one of my colleagues did the earlier session, so hopefully I'll keep that same bar and that same standard. Congratulations to all the work that you're doing nationally, but also in your region, and thanks for having an interloper like myself join this discussion. I'm zooming in from my home office in Brooklyn in Bedford-Stuyvesant, where we've got many similar challenges. And part of the reason I joined the Brooklyn Community Foundation, not just because they're focused on Brooklyn, but because they have a racial equity through line that is core to all the work that we do. So thank you all. I'm going to do what consultants do, which is present some slides. And that's not the fun part of the discussion, but hopefully it will serve as a foundation as we move into a broader panel discussion. And I know this group is largely experts on this space, but my intent always in these discussions is to share the latest insights that as we see them from the Institute, provide some language and nomenclature as these things evolve, because some of these concepts are fairly nascent, but then also provide some hard and concrete facts that help to hopefully catalyze action and help us more clearly communicate what the opportunity is. Owing to the feedback in the chat, I'm actually going to turn my video off so that you all can, that wasn't the plan, but I'm going to turn my video off so you all can see the slides in full view. And then we'll come back on for the panel. So in 2020, we spent time with this group, and I know some of you are new to this particular forum, discussing emerging research around the racial wealth gap in the US. And we've looked at this across a number of different racial groups. I personally lead our Institute for Black Economic Mobility, and foundationally, we put out a piece back, I want to say 2018 now, that looked at the size of the racial wealth gap and laid the foundation for what it would be worth to the economy if we could actually close the wealth gap between Black Americans, in this case, and white Americans. And did a bunch of econometric modeling and had all these different scenarios. But the upshot is that there's substantial economic opportunity that is being left on the table, on the order of $1 trillion+ of lost economic output. And others have looked at this. Citigroup, several of the feds around the country have looked at this. And so I think it's, regardless of what you think the specific number is, there's a significant amount of economic value being left on the table by us not more fully embracing inclusive growth. And so that's the starting point. So our institute, we are Institute for Economic Mobility. We have a few different pillars. One is research and insights. We spend a lot of time publishing and really. Sorry, are the slides blurry for everyone? Can you just put in the chat, or is it just on my side? Yeah. Okay, I'm not sure why that is. I'm going to, let's see if it helps if I come back on screen and make them, they're smaller but still blurry. Yeah, I'm not sure why that is. Whoever's controlling the slides, if you're using some sort of a zoom function, zoom in function, it's creating a blurred view of the slides. So anyway, sorry, we'll have to just push through it because I'm not sure technically what's happening there. So our research is one piece of this, where we're doing deep insight, anchored in economics, try to understand what's happening with disparity and what the opportunities are. The second is convening. This falls squarely into the category of convening. So very delighted and happy to be bringing these insights to groups like this. And real world impact is the last pillar. This is really about how do we translate the research and insights actually into capabilities and tools that people actually go drive and do things to help address some of these challenges. You can see on the right-hand side, we've done a number of different research pieces. We're going to go a bit deeper into the case for inclusive growth, which is one that we published earlier this year, making the broad economic case for why we should be pushing towards a more inclusive economy. So what is this concept of economic growth? Well, we suggest, or we assert, that economic growth and mobility are connected. And we should be thinking about how we increase prosperity, but also are more thoughtful and deliberate about that resource distribution. And so you see this chart here, the horizontal axis is economic prosperity. You can think about GDP per capita as a proxy, so size and growth of the economy. And then resource distribution. How does that economic prosperity, that growth, you think about maybe just in income distribution, how is that distributed? Is it concentrated or is it distributed broadly? And we firmly believe that we need to be pushing towards this upper right quadrant. And we actually, you'll notice that the big circle there is larger than the second, the to from circle, if you will, on the right of each of these quadrants is larger, because we fundamentally know from history and from our understanding of economics that if you have a broader distribution, you will grow faster. And this is a concept that I think people are increasingly discussing. I think it's a big part of when people are having conversations about moving from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, and really considering the whole, and taking, when you overlay this temporal component, taking a longer term view of how you think about success and prosperity. And so that's really the discussion that we've been having a lot with our clients across the public, private, and social sector. So without inclusion, economic growth leads to lots of inequality, social and impact inequality, and it has huge implications for living standards. So you see on the left-hand side, this chart of productivity, net productivity versus hourly compensation. And there's this huge disconnect. I mean, we become in some ways, in parts of our economy, obsessed with productivity. And productivity, I think, is in general economic terms, and I'm sure there's some comments on it, productivity is a good thing. That being said, the question is productivity to what end, and who accrues the benefits of improved productivity. And you can see that hourly compensation has not risen much at all over this same time period. And so begin to ask ourselves, why is that? And is that acceptable? And what are the broad implications over the long run? Lack of social cohesion and things like that. And then you see on the right-hand side this mobility chart, which looks at various groups. And what you see is a couple of things. One, just lots of disparity at the outset in terms of household income across different groups. But then you see, frankly, very little mobility in many instances, and in some cases, downward mobility. And this presents fundamental challenges, as we know, to the narrative that we have as a country around the American dream. And if you work hard, you'll do better, and it's a meritocracy. And so I think this chart really starts to put into sharp focus the question of, are we living into that narrative and to those shared values, or are those a thing of the past that we're willing to just say, hey, this is the way it works out now, and we move forward. And I don't think that personally that's the right answer, because I think it has lots of implications for stagnation of the economy and a loss of dynamism and a loss of competitiveness. So you'll see on the left-hand side of this chart, this idea of upward mobility, and basically the percentages reflect the percent of children born into poverty, and forget it, maybe it was bottom decile of income of the family when they're born, and then the likelihood that they'll reach the middle class. And I think this is based on Raj Chetty's data, and so it's backward looking, but you see exactly what I mean. This stagnation, and it's particularly acute you see for Native Americans and for African Americans. And so this again is this question of, should your race play such a large role in your ability to move up in this country? I think most people would say no, but is it I think most people would have to say yes after looking at this data. And it has huge, sorry, can you go back? I hadn't finished. And that has negatively affected the lives and livelihoods of many families. And certainly COVID-19 has brought that into very sharp focus. If you look at businesses, only 8% of businesses, and Tawanna, thank you for the discussion earlier around buying local and supporting these diverse businesses. It's so important. Only 8% of businesses are Black and Hispanic owned in the US, despite the fact that these groups make up 31% of the population. That has huge implications for the dollars that get invested in the communities where folks live. It has huge implications for who gets jobs. And so it's not just the business ownership piece, which is certainly about the value creation for business owners. It's also it also has downstream implications as well. Financial insecurity, 2 to 3 times more likely to be underbanked when compared to the white population. And if you think about banking as the most basic form of financial inclusion, the fact that there's such gaps even at that level tells you that we've got so much more work to do. Automation and underdevelopment of this huge pool of talent. We know the looming, some people say threat or opportunity created by automation is set to disproportionately impact certain segments of the population. In many ways, automation will help to magnify existing disparity if we're not proactive and thoughtful about it. And then this notion of frayed and underserved communities, we've all read, it's been widely covered, the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on certain groups. Sometimes I watch the news or I read an article and I hear folks sounding surprised about that. We all knew ex ante. We did a report in April of 2020, right when the pandemic was starting to really accelerate, asserting exactly what would happen, and not because we at McKinsey have a crystal ball, just because we've seen all these exogenous events before, and we know who gets hit harder. So what are we going to do to address that? And then certainly the interactions with the criminal justice system for certain Americans are disproportionately negative, and it's a social consequence of many of these other things we've talked about as it relates to economic participation. So with all that, at some kind of macro level, what does all that mean, right? I mean, in just cold hard economic terms, in the spirit of inclusive growth, we think there's trillions of dollars that would result from closing these various gaps. And that shows up in lots of different places. It shows up in business ecosystems and generating additional businesses, and which shows up as balance sheet assets for the business owners. Again, it shows up as jobs, and it shows up as other community investment. The Q&A thing is a little bit distracting. I think we're going to get there in the end. So we'll log all those questions for sure, but it blocks the PowerPoint. So apologies for pausing. Individuals reaching their full potential, huge wage gap, families building financial security. The list goes on and on. And so there are certainly big economic consequences from getting this right, but I also am mindful that these cascade down into real quality of life improvements for individuals that I think we also should value as much as we should the economic output. So I think this idea of inclusive growth is something that is still, people are still trying to wrestle to ground what it is and what we mean when we say it. But most practitioners, and we did a pretty comprehensive survey, this is only a subset of the of experts in this space, this is only a subset of the results, but they believe it's about ensuring that growth broadly benefits everyone, all members of society. And certainly embedded in that is this idea of benefiting vulnerable populations or populations that have been left out. But I think at the highest level, it's not about any one group. It's about ensuring that the economic benefits accrue to all groups, irrespective of race and irrespective, frankly, even of starting point, which goes back to this notion of opportunities for economic mobility. So as we think about what folks are doing, and I think there's a few big areas, and then how do we operationalize it? There's understanding the current state, and we've been spending time. Others have been looking at this for a long time. There's a whole body of work in academia that's looking at different elements of this, but really trying to understand the current state and being bold in our aspirations about what we're going to do about it. Designing comprehensive community and human-based intervention. So really this whole notion of, which is why I love what you all are doing here in the region, anchoring on place, understanding the communities we're in, understanding the organizational infrastructure in these communities, and really designing interventions that are centered on people and where people in the community have input. And then being coordinated and ensuring accountability. I think one of the failure modes in all movements, and we looked at this a couple of years ago, looked at all of these different movements, whether it was or big coordinated efforts, marriage equality. I mean, you name. We looked at a bunch. And we said, what is the differentiator in successful outcomes? And it's this notion of being more coordinated and having a clearer set of objectives and goals, and then an accountability framework. Fragmentation. I think fragmentation is great to incubate entrepreneurial ideas, but at some level, you need to be coordinated so you can get to some scale. And so how do we think about building more of that in? And then you see on the right side, we need technical expertise, we need community engagement, and we need to be adaptive and recognize that we need to come up with new approaches and have an open mindset to understand all the different stakeholders and starting points if we're going to really drive inclusive growth. So I'm just going to end on just a few highlights from some of the research that we've recently done under the banner "The Economic State of Black America: What It Is and What It Could Be." And I'll share out the link for the report. It's 150 plus pages, so I'd find what you like in there and focus on that chapter. We wanted it to be a bit of a catch-all, but recognize that not everything is relevant to everyone. So Black workers face huge gaps in representation and participation. Again, for the focus of this is Black workers. We're doing similar work with other groups in the country, replicating this approach. But we found a $220 billion annual wage gap. So if you think about Black Americans as 13.5% of the population, and you assume that we should have the same share of the total wages that are paid, we're falling about $220 billion short. We'll come back to that. On the business front, I mentioned this before, but very, very small number of employer Black-owned businesses. So businesses that have more than one employee. So non-sole proprietorships. Only 2% of businesses in the U.S. are Black-owned that have more than one or more employees. And the businesses tend to be smaller. There's all sorts of challenges there that we'll talk about. Black consumer is one that is new and that we've been spending a lot of time thinking about. Certainly consumption is an incredibly important part of the economy, but consumption is also, I think sometimes consumption gets a bad rap because people think consumer goods and spending and things we don't need, and it's kind of thinking about the consumer is antithetical to thinking about savings, but it's not. And when I talk about consumption, actually, in a large sense, I'm talking about very basic things that we need to live and survive and to maintain a certain amount of human dignity. I'm thinking about things like affordable quality housing, affordable quality financial services and products, affordable healthcare, affordable, fresh, high quality food. And we find huge opportunities and frankly, widespread neglect of the Black consumer and just general dissatisfaction with the options that are available against a number of these categories, which I think creates a win-win, both a opportunity for the private sector in some instances to build a loyal customer base while delivering essential services and goods that people actually want and are willing to pay for. Fourth is savers and investors. There's a huge wealth gap. The starting point is difficult because there's about $200 billion of missing inheritance in the Black community every year. Again, using this fair share logic. We all know the history of redlining and being left out of the wealth creation that many in this country went through at an earlier period in history. That has lingering effects. Lower incomes make it more challenging, obviously, to save. And then lack of participation in the mainstream financial services sector is both a symptom and a cause. And so there's lots of opportunity there. And then residents. How do we think about the program design and delivery? And we at McKinsey don't wade too much into policy, but obviously it's hard because this is on that line. But if you think about the decisions that we've made on how we fund education, we've decided that your income, your wealth, of which your home value is a proxy for, and therefore your property taxes are a direct result of, should determine the resourcing in your schools. That's a decision that we've made to put less resources into places that maybe need them more. We can choose to make a different decision. And I think there's a general theme about public policy design and delivery, and the question that I always ask is, do these programs, maybe not deliberately, but by design, amplify disparity? So lastly, I'll just hit on a couple of things just to reiterate. 43% of Black workers are in jobs that pay less than $30,000 a year. It doesn't matter where you live in this country in 2021. It is difficult to have any level of financial security given the cost of basic necessities. Further, many of these workers are in what we deemed during this crisis of COVID as essential workers. And yet we time and time again do not treat them as essential workers, because if we did, the pay would reflect that, the benefit structure would reflect that, the predictability of work would reflect that. Business owners, as I said, 2% of private US employer firms are Black owned. We've got to do more. Corporations have huge vendor spend budgets. I'm going to forget the number. It might be like 58 cents on every dollar of economic contribution by businesses comes through what they pay suppliers. How do we use that collective pool of money that's already being spent to help foster and create new businesses and new opportunities? Consumers. 2.7 million Black Americans live in what the US government defines as deserts. Now, each of the different types of deserts is defined in a different way, but think about overlapping deserts. So 2.7 million Americans live in places that are at once healthcare, food, and housing deserts. And then if you go into each of those individual deserts, the numbers jump up. 6 to 8 million live in food deserts. So huge opportunities there. Mean wealth. This number's been widely covered. I think one other number that's not up here is 19% of Black Americans have negative net worth, so owe more in debt than they have in assets. That it is tremendously suffocating to be in that bucket of 20% of Black Americans who really have no real way out but to live under the thumb of that debt. And it's debt coming from a lot of different places. And we know the student loan debt issue is obviously one area that's received a lot of attention. And back to this point on public spending and public programs, we estimate that 30% of public spending goes to programs that have embedded features that actually amplify racial disparity. And again, that's not a foregone conclusion. We can make a different set of choices. But as it stands, we have decided that the wealth and income that you have should determine whether you get a great education and whether you have access to healthcare coverage. Just a decision that we've made. So with that, I will end this presentation. Hopefully, there's some interesting things here that prompt a discussion, and look forward to discussing with everyone.
Thank you so much for that, Shelley. Again, our team has been solving for the tech side of things, and I apologize for what the appearance of the presentation is showing up much differently than what our team reports from the trial. However, we have linked the report from McKinsey Black Economic Mobility that the presentation data comes from, so that folks can go see there. A lot of that report is derived from original research, both quantitative and qualitative surveying that Shelley referenced, and I serve on the external advisory council for McKinsey in this work, and really want to encourage, based on what I see in the chat, you all to go look at that report, get familiar with this institute that Shelley is leading, because the research that is being done and the work that is being done is really groundbreaking and very much is centering Black communities in each of the roles that Shelley just lifted up in ways that are meaningful, is very non-traditional from what we are accustomed to seeing, not only McKinsey, but other organizations and corporations like McKinsey, and is valuable to the field based on what we want to see and our shared goals, and is the reason that we began engaging McKinsey in this way last January in 2020, and why we're engaging again now. At this point, I want to bring in our 3 reaction panelists who are going to join Shelley and I for a deeper conversation now. So welcome with me, Char Dobbs, Steve Grove, and Velma Korbel. I want to introduce them. Char Dobbs is the Chief Operating Officer for the Activate Network. Steve Grove is our Commissioner at the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development. And Velma Korbel is Vice President and Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for API Group, and no stranger to many of us in this market. Welcome, my friends, my colleagues, and ambassadors in this work. I am thrilled to be able to talk with each one of you about this work. I want to invite the 3 of you who are coming in first to do brief introductions of yourselves and the work with you. Char, I'm going to begin with you. Welcome.
Sure. Thank you for having me. So I'm Char Dobbs, co-owner and COO of the Activate Network, and we are a company that cultivates powerful experiences, programming, and events for Black women and women of color to thrive at home and in the workplace. I'm also the co-founder of Certified Access, which is an initiative focused on helping women of color businesses become certified, to increase that by 10%, to increase the spend with women of color businesses through corporate and government by 10% by 2030. So thrilled again to be here.
Welcome. Thank you so much. Commissioner Grove.
Thanks, Tawanna. Shelley, good to see you. And hello, everybody. Thanks for having me today. I'm Steve Grove, Commissioner of the Department of Employment and Economic Development. Our mission is quite simply to empower the growth of the Minnesota economy for everyone. I come into this role from the private sector. Before here at Deed, I was at Google for 12 years, serving in a variety of roles at that company. And I'm originally from Minnesota, but spent some time in Silicon Valley. While I was there, my wife and I started a small nonprofit called Silicon North Stars, where every year we bring a collection of young people from the Twin Cities, mostly Black and brown young people, all below the poverty line, to Silicon Valley to have access to that technology marketplace, to do training on startup creation and on technology careers. And then we build kind of career pathways for them into those fields. And we've continued to do that work here in Minnesota too. So that's a bit of on the personal side, but thanks for having me and excited for this discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you. Ms. Korbel.
Hello, Tawanna. Shelley, it's very nice to meet you. Sure, I'm just pleased and thrilled to be on this panel with you. I am Velma Korbel. I'm the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for API Group in New Brighton, Minnesota. And API is a construction services company. It's about a $6 billion company, about 12,000 employees, mostly in North America. We just made an announcement here in the last several weeks that we're going through a significant acquisition of London-based company Chubb Fire Security, which will essentially double the size of the company and revenue and number of employees. I am about to celebrate my 1-year anniversary with API Group. And just prior to coming here, I was the Director of Civil Rights for the city of Minneapolis. And just prior to that, the Commissioner of Human Rights for the state of Minnesota. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you. I want to start with you, actually, Velma, with this first question. In reflecting on all that Shelley just elevated for us, you know that we're an organization, we drive solutions that are very much data informed. And so it's not a surprise that we'd start with a very data rich conversation. And yet I think where Shelley ended there with that reminder, not only about the data in reference to the different roles that we play in terms of being consumers and workers and business owners, but also I think I took note of one of those last points that often at this point, there's 30% of public spending is on programs that are amplifying racial disparities. And he ended with that note, but with a but, I took it as a but. There are things that private companies can be doing that could be able to address that. When you think about everything that we've experienced over the last, I'm going to say not just year, but 2 years, are things changing? What do you see in our economy? And do we have reason for hope and optimism based on what you see across the economy?
So let me just try to answer that in its various component parts and start by saying I want to lift up the work that the center is doing. Organizations like the Urban League, the Business Partnership Coalition for Racial Equity, the African American Leadership Forum, the Federal Reserve. So there are a lot of organizations who are grappling with this, what is an intractable issue, and it shouldn't be, because I believe that the solutions are there, and we just have to be bold enough and courageous enough to go find them. So to Shelley's, the data is, I hear this data a lot, Shelley. Thank you for what McKinsey is doing. You know, I'm getting to the point now, I'm reading so many McKinsey reports that I'm starting to claim the results as my own, because you're doing some really wonderful work there. But this is, it's not shocking, but it is another light that is shining on results that we who do this work a lot, who've done it for years, really know about, but it's good to see it in this format. I am hopeful, Tawanna. I am hopeful that with so many organizations, good organizations paying attention to this, with so many resources now that have been identified and devoted to this, I'm hopeful that we will make some new ground. I've been doing this work a long time, and I used to believe that it was just lack of awareness, disinterest in moving the work forward and solving some of these intractable issues. But now it is, what is it? When you know better, do better. We know better, and it's time for us to do better. So I'm hopeful that we are starting to know better. There are a lot of us looking at these issues and problems, and I just have hope. And so I'm just thrilled to be here to continue this conversation today. So I'm ready to stop hand wringing and actually to start moving the needle on some things.
I'll ask the other panelists to respond to the same question.
Sure. I guess I can go next. Velma, well said, and I agree. The data is power here, and you can't get enough of it. It's so important to tell the story of what's happening, not only in our region, but in the country, as Shelley has done. You know, there's a lot of reason for pessimism, but a lot of reason for optimism. I think, you know, this pandemic, to state the obvious, exacerbated some of the really deep racial inequities we see in Minnesota far beyond what they ever were. We're particularly concerned about the massive decrease in labor force participation by people of color in Minnesota over the past year and a half. We have seen some of those gaps in unemployment shrink, but not always for the right reasons. So we are seeing, a degree of challenge here that is, I think, unique to the moment. But we're also seeing some signs that this could be the moment where things turn around. And part of that's in the data, and part of that's in what we're seeing in the community here in the Twin Cities. And the data front, we are finally seeing wages go up for the first time in a very, very long time. Not fast enough and probably not equitable enough, but they are across the board going up. That's a good thing. And more broadly, you're seeing this kind of unprecedented moment of worker power in our economy, in our country, given one of the most pervasive labor shortages that our country has seen in a very, very long time. And I think the pandemic gave people of all backgrounds a chance to step back and look at the world of work and ask themselves, what's a good job in today's economy? Now, some people have options and some people don't, but the virus, the lack of childcare, and the pretty steep inequities we see in our economy, income and racial together, I think have made a lot of people reevaluate where our economy is headed. You have seen, I think, in this community, the knowledge that Minnesota and Minneapolis have been in the global spotlight for reasons that have caused a conversation, I think, about race and equity that is a long time coming. And we at our department see a lot of businesses, a lot of organizations, and certainly government really grappling with that in what feel like very real ways. What we do moving forward, what we do in these coming 2 years that is different from the last 2 years, I think is the big question. But I think it is a moment with a lot of possibility, even though we, in some ways, this last few years dug ourselves a deeper hole with the pandemic's arrival here in Minnesota. So lots to grapple with right now, but it's conversations like this that are going to help us move forward.
I would agree with my panelists here, and I approach it from a yes and perspective. And going back to what Ms. Velma said about, courage, and when we know better, we have to do better. And so I believe, we can always have hope, but digging into the hope and not letting small incrementals of increase, blind us from the work that still needs to be done. And so really, digging into that of the numbers, disaggregating the numbers. I know someone mentioned that earlier, and fine tuning some of that and continuing to move forward, but knowing that it will be the image I get is continuing to rip the Band-Aid off. Like it's going to continue to feel uncomfortable, which is why we have to, embrace the courage and the boldness to be able to continue to step forward, because I don't think it will be comfortable for a long time because we have so much work to do. It's so deep rooted. And so I think the hope is that having hope in the work versus hope in just the numbers, seeing those go up. And so I really think if we can embrace the journey, that's where our attention, is going to be and what's required.
I love that, embracing the journey. What does that journey look like? And Shelley, I want to come over to you. And you left us with that provocative notion around kind of how do you start to marry the work required among sectors while also considering the importance of community. And we talk a lot in our organization about proximity, the necessity of being proximate to solutions and problems. And there we say that solutions and problems are found in the same place. Living that out is often more difficult than one would hope. And you, when you touched on consumerism, said often we hear that word and we can think of it as a bad thing. As we just had this conversation last week on your advisory council, right? That we've got to go beyond the mystique to really where those solutions are found. What does it look like to embrace not only the journey, but then embrace it long enough to get to solutions in communities that are really wrestling with this, particularly in places like Minneapolis, St. Paul?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, it goes a little bit back to maybe the third to last page, but this whole embrace, in my opinion, of place-based transformations where you've got the private, the social, and the public sector finally understanding that it's not about going deep on one vertical. It's not just about education, right? But it's actually about swarming around the community, an integrated set of issues, right? And so building on that momentum that people are accepting that is you're seeing a lot of big philanthropists now say, oh, I've got this education initiative that's great, but maybe actually I need to have an integrated initiative in a place that looks at education, looks at healthcare, that looks at social capital development. I mean, just a number of things. And so I do think that we're at kind of a really good point there. And the thing that I love is you can now also get very specific about the objectives, right? It's very hard at the national level. Things get, the numbers are interesting, but like not that actionable. Like, does it really matter that, at the US level, there's 2%? Yeah, we know the number should go up, but like, what does that actually look like locally? And so I think getting to sustained action now is about at the local level, what are the target outcomes that we're going to push on in education, in healthcare, in local infrastructure, in how we're going to close the consumer deserts, and having measurable objectives against those. And then having who are the partners, who are the community partners. I think I heard mentioned Urban League and some of the legacy civil rights organizations. In some parts of the country, for example, in many Black communities, HBCUs in the Southeast can be that anchor. Who are the organizations that have the right and the relationships in these places to really be the voice of the community, along with the local business leaders, along with the public sector organizations, and move against some tangible goals with greater cohesion than I think we've traditionally seen.
I want to build off that, if I could, Tawanna, just for a moment on the measurable goals piece, because I think as much as data about what's happening is important, data about what we're going to do is even more important. And one of the things that's guiding our efforts at DEED is the One Minnesota plan, which is a very metrics-driven strategic plan for the state. And our top 3 goals for the agency in that plan are all related to equity. The first is to shrink the unemployment disparities between whites and BIPOC Minnesotans by 50% by the end of next year. The second is to gain back all the jobs we lost at the start of the pandemic, with a particular concentration on the pockets of highest unemployment, which are those that are most likely to be where Black and brown individuals live. And then the third is focused on our workforce and achieving a kind of pre-pandemic recovery to the number of people who are getting into jobs through our programs, with specific increases for women, BIPOC, and adults with disabilities. So just to give you a sense, like this idea of having data-driven goals, we think is super important to our efforts. And then, to Shelley's point, who are the stakeholders? What's the plan to make that happen? Really critical.
So what gets in the way of, I think there's this gap, and this is part of that, I think that pain point you talked about, Char, a little bit in terms of embracing the uncomfortableness, right? Because often, I don't think it's unusual for us to have those types of goals. I think the devil gets in the details in terms of the water that's required to go deep enough into the groundwater of what keeps us from those goals, right? And so how do we not only declare the goal on the end, but the notion of, okay, how many Black and brown led organizations and businesses do we have to invest in order to get that result? Do we trust the very people who are required in order to get that result? Because everything we've done to date has not gotten us there. And so it's going to take a drastically different formula to get that. And are we willing to write that down at the same time that we declare those bold goals, that to get to lean on that language of courageous and bold? And often we're not. When we talk about systemic change, often we are not. And so what does it take in these moments of transformation to shift communities enough to look at this data and say, wait a minute, the data suggests, and it does, that we have to be just that bold. And Commissioner, I'm in those rooms, those are the conversations we have. But what does it take for communities to now get on the same side of the table and say, how do we write that language down at the same time within multiple sectors, so that all the arrows are pointing in the same way and we move dollars and cents at the same time that we move the language of the goals?
I will jump.
Oh, go ahead.
I'll jump in with that one, Tawanna, if you don't mind. I think what's needed is the courage to really center race in our conversations, and that's been missing. And so these organizations that I named earlier are all organizations who are unapologetic about centering race in this conversation. The other thing that I think is new and different is that listening to Black-led organizations and listening to Black leaders is imperative, because I was thinking about this over the weekend, and it's You know, when I go into the doctor's office and I have a sniffle and runny nose, I mean, I don't want to be prescribed, you know, the ice pack for my head, the chest rub for my chest, the foot rub, the whatever. I just want the pill that is going to cure what I have. And the way you can help cure me is to listen to me and to listen to the symptoms that I describe. And I think that the reason that we are going to have some success in this region is that organizations are finally listening to Black leaders and listening to Black-led organizations about what it is and what it's going to take. And Shelley talked about looking at all of this as a system. And for too many generations, Black and Brown people have just not been viewed as being part of that system. And one of those cogs in the wheel that creates the vitality that we need in our regional economy. And so when I talk about hope, that is what I'm talking about. And it is finally listening to the people who know what we need. We know what we need to make our communities vibrant. And so I am just really interested in hearing more about, you know, the goal setting that Commissioner Grove and his colleagues are doing at the state level.
I would add to that, and to build off of Ms. Velma's example of, you know, the body, and, you know, if I go in for a sniffle to the doctor, you know, I want, you know, listen to me, to my ailments and help prescribe something. So I think it's also a holistic approach to the goal setting, you know, in general, and understanding that what we thought was the goal may not be the goal, or maybe the goal has to be broken down even more because there's so much underlying work that may come up as we start to progress towards the goal. And to give it, I want to give a specific example of that, because we are in the world of certification and helping with women of color owned businesses, is that, for example, we know that Amazon back in, was that July or August, released this big, you know, fund for women of color to apply to get this grant. However, in the fine print was that the women of color had to be certified businesses. So if you knew women of color, the number of women of color certified business, if we go the approach of WeBank, you know, so the corporate certification, knowing that the women of color, the number is so low, I believe it's below 10%, you know, so understanding that if we're already dealing with the issue that many women of color businesses aren't even certified, and then to release, you know, to accomplish this goal of giving the money, but hey, there's this obstacle that if you're not already certified, you can't even apply or get it. So that's understanding, like, yes, we have this great goal. Hey, we're doing, you know, we're giving the money, but there's this underlying issue that may become apparent in that process. And so, okay, yes, we have this goal, but this goal may need to be rolled back, you know, a bit to address this other piece that comes up. So I think, you know, that holistic approach and applying some, I don't know if the word is grace, but allowing flexibility for things to come up, because understanding sometimes at the surface level, it's going to require additional, you know, pieces to it, you know, as we are listening to our leaders and listening, you know, and making those other changes. So being able to apply that to our goals, our goal setting as well. And of course, the innovation, you know, what we've done before hasn't worked. So how do we continue to innovate within our teams? And how do you give your teams permission and more support to innovate? If the goals are created, but how your team is rewarded doesn't match that goal, that's an issue, because then, you know, your team there's a divided, you know, mission, there's a divided purpose at that point.
It's so true, Char. Just, you know, I will say that idea that you should, as Tawanna said earlier, be able to have the uncomfortable conversations and be okay trying stuff, failing and trying again. I'll speak from this person who's in government, and Velma, you know, as you've been in government too. It's challenging. In government, there is not that mindset of like, let's try and iterate and try and fail. And it's a more risk-averse culture. So we're trying to create space for that inside of our department. For me, as like a white male leader of a department that's grappling with these challenges, the most important thing I can do is surround myself with Black and Brown leaders who are in the community and understand these issues far deeper than I ever will. And then trying to figure out what does real meaningful change look like. And I see in the chat some conversations around what can we do now? What are the real things one of the things we've realized, because we've been doing equity goal making for 3 years since I started, is that it's easy to say, okay, let's increase the number of grantees we reach in Black communities by 10% or something like that. Or let's ramp up our outreach by 25% in communities of color. And those are meaningful things, don't get me wrong, but they are by definition incremental.
Right.
In the conversation, of course, over the last year, a couple of years in particular, has been around systemic changes, and that's harder. And so we've tried to look at areas where we think the system just isn't working. And no matter how much you increase a percentage goal or a metric, you're not going to change things long term. And so we went through a massive effort on this over the last year on the Workforce Development Fund in our state, trying to completely revamp it for equity. I'll tell you, we failed. We tried extremely hard, the legislature, to change it, and the Republican Senate wouldn't agree to our changes, which was disappointing. We're not giving up, but systemic change is hard. And I'll say that this year, the strategic plan that we'll be releasing later in December for kind of the coming year is all focused on how different teams are doing change efforts focused on the systemic issues, not the incremental. It's harder, and it's taken us some more time. And we're bringing in experts to help us learn along the way, Tawanna and others. But that's where you can really start to move these large agencies, is when you try to get at that systems level. And you have to be okay taking swings like we did with the Workforce Development Fund and failing, and then just trying again. And that's, to your point on innovation, you have to imbibe that into your culture to make a difference. And it's hard, but it's important. What else can we possibly be doing right now? We have to do this.
Yeah, I want to go over to Shelley and ask one of the questions from the audience and start to bring in some of these audience questions. I have to, though, say I think it's huge as we think about public policy to be sure that as departments, whether it's a city department or a state department or county department, are going after public policy change, that we're weaving in community. And I think we've seen a lot of wins in our work by going hand in hand. There's a lot of things that I can say to an elected, or our organizations can say, that as state leaders, you can't say, as county and city leaders, you can't say. And some of our best successes have been when our leaders have called on us and said, okay, Tawanna, can you bring a team of folks in? Here's what we need to go for. But we can't go fight that fight. It's our fight, but we can't go fight it in the same way that you and residents and business owners can go fight it. Now, how do we go in hand? But we often end up failing at the end of a session or at the end of a council year when we've gone after the same fight, but we've gone after it completely alone and isolated, and then got to the end of a session and said, oh, we all are sitting here with losses. And really, it's not any of our losses. The people who lose are the communities that we're fighting for, because we all tried to go at it alone and in silos. And as I've said last week to the Economic Development Organization, shame on all of us. Like, at some point, it should be us who are losing because we fought in the wrong ways for the communities that we're going after. Shelley, I want to elevate a question for you coming from the audience. You elevated in the last slide there, public policy spending that exacerbates disparities. And we have a person in the chat who says that this is an important concept that often those in positions of privilege have difficulty thinking about and conceiving. Can you give us examples of that, so that some of these solutions can become really concrete?
Yeah, and look, I'll be careful here, because again, I don't really do policy. I'll just give some. I mean, these are just factual statements about how the programs work. I gave one example. We choose to fund public education, largely speaking, in a certain way based on property taxes. That amplifies disparity. Another example is, may not sound that intuitive to folks, but the way that Social Security accrues over time is a function of your income, how long you're in the labor force. And so your benefits reflect that. Well, if you know that there's a wage gap and disparity there, and because of health inequity, there's huge labor force, health inequity and criminal justice related issues, that we don't participate in the labor force for as long, well, then certainly when you need your Social Security benefits, they're going to be smaller. And so that's not a value judgment one way or the other, but it's just a fact. And we can choose to make a different set of choices. We can say, actually, what we want to do is, and by the way, on education, we are unique among, and this is not, I'm getting a little bit outside of my expertise, but we are unique with respect to other OECD countries. Some people find it ironic when you talk to colleagues in other parts of the world that we spend the least on our students who need it the most, given how important human capital is to having a thriving economy. We can make a different set of choices.
Love that. Love each one of those examples. And I think they're resonating with some of the other both ideas and concepts that are coming up in the chat for us. I want to elevate, there was a question around what you meant by certification. I think that one you've answered, Char, already, and it's been, there've been great things in the chat. I want to applaud everybody in the chat. All of our attendees are giving great resources and tools. So a big shout out to all of you who are attending today for all the resources and ideas in the chat. Alex has lifted up questions related to education and how we can begin to change the educational budget allocation based on home values. Ideas, folks here today? This may be one we don't have expertise on. Any, Shelley?
No, I mean, look, I think it just, again, I don't want to be giving, policy advice. I would just say that it's not, the how is actually not complicated. We could just decide to flip it, right? We can decide how to spend budgets, right? So, I think you all can come up with whatever the actual policy is, but there's a pot of money. That money gets spent on stuff, and we can choose to ask folks who make those decisions to allocate it in a different way. I think part of this is just not accepting the status quo, right? It's actually very hard for people like, oh, well, of course, I pay property taxes. I live in a place that has high property values. My kid should get a great, and that isn't intuitive. But again, if we zoom out for a second and we say, as a society, are we okay with the outcome that decision drives and what it perpetuates? And it's not a race thing. We know, I don't know if you all have read The Meritocracy Trap, but we're getting to this point where the income share is captured by such a smaller portion of people in this country. I don't feel like that's tenable. So then we can just make a whole different set of choices, acknowledging that they're difficult.
I appreciate that notion around us really questioning ourselves about what we're okay with. And we elevate that often with our clients when we're working with employers, whether in the public or private sector. But I find that often, you mentioned meritocracy, often it's about how much we know, and how I mentioned proximity earlier. I think often we are so disconnected from one another. You can be in a space, but not connected very often. And not just in this world of quarantine and Zoom, but just even when we are face to face with one another, how much we know about the people that we're working with, how they are experiencing not just wages, but experiencing life and experiencing our environments is often distant. And so I want to ask a final question that I hope gets us some real dialogue between all five of us here is, how are our Black and Brown workers informing strategies in your organizations? And I'll ask this both in terms of the organizations where you work, but also those coalitions you may be working in who are taking on building racial equity, anti-racism, and economic prosperity. How are workers informing those solutions? And if the answer is maybe not a whole lot, what ways do you think workers could and should be informing those solutions? And in particular, I'm going to zero in on those workers who are at the lowest rungs of the economic ladder in order for us to build that economy that is working for all of us.
Tawanna, I'll jump in there first, and I can tell you, I'll start by talking about API Group a little bit. API Group is a company that's been around since 1926, and it's grown to its size mostly by acquisition. It is a construction services company, and we all know that the construction industry is not very diverse with women or people of color. Here at our own enterprise, we're sitting at about less than 20% people of color, and the majority of those people of color are Hispanic and Latino, and they are located on the coast and in the southern part of the country. So in the Midwest is not very diverse in terms of our workforce at all. I can tell you that API, the leadership here has made a significant commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and have started to have conversations about the racial impacts of what we're trying to do. And this is new for them. And I've told them, you can make the commitment. You don't have to have all of the strategies lined up right away, but you at least have to take that first step. And I think that they've done that. So we are just on the very beginning stages of doing what I hope to be some really good work. But we're also in a position as one of the largest companies in Minnesota to be able to influence other companies to take up that mantle in the same way. I have been pleased, now moving away from API Group, to be part of a couple of different tables and a couple of different coalitions that are really centering race in the conversation and centering the voices of the most vulnerable, kind of that, what is it, Shelley said, the lower decile of employees, and listening to what employees need to be able to shape a workforce for the future. So I think companies, there are many companies that are just at the beginning stages of this conversation, but I think there's so much power in these coalitions that have been formed around this issue. And I think that's probably going to be where our greatest opportunities are. And it is looking at this region as a system. And I think we have, there's great potential there.
Thank you, Velma.
Yeah, that's really well said. And it's interesting to hear how you're grappling that with workers and some of those broader industry trends. I would say, indeed, first of all, we do listen to our Black and brown workers, I think, more so than has ever been true in the past. And I will say that over the past year and a half, I've had some pretty raw conversations internally as an entire agency, 1,400 people, about the role that racism even plays internally in our operations as an organization. You gotta have a solid foundation in your own house before you're doing work externally a lot of times. So we're doing work internally indeed to start. In terms of Black workers and brown workers externally, I mean, we hold a series of focus groups of small business owners that are primarily Black and brown. We have various councils, emerging entrepreneurship loan program, et cetera, that give us access into these conversations. But I think the more powerful thing that we as an agency can do probably is the ways in which we connect companies to potential Black workers and potential job seekers in this really unique and critical moment for workforce development. And I think the center has done a lot of this too. How do you help companies access pools of labor they don't usually think about and make connections to job seekers for whom the opportunity to work for them could just transform their families and their communities? And part of that is having offices like our Immigrant Refugees group in play. Part of it's having our Office of Economic Opportunity doing hard work, but you have to be assertive. And I think those efforts have to be informed by what workers need, what workers view as the challenge, what workers view as the opportunity. So you have to start with your customer in mind and work back. A Google way to phrase, focus on the user, right? Start there and then build from there. You got to focus on the worker, focus on the job seeker first and build from there. Then you're building the right systems and pathways. So I'm really glad you asked the question. Even the question itself just needs to be front and center for our mind every day because it's critical to being successful.
For us, I think we have the privilege of being a Black woman-owned company. And so everything we do, is informed by Black and brown women, in this case. And so with that, to go beyond that, we hire 95% of our hires, whether it's freelance in-house is, Black and brown, and as well as when we, contract in speakers, but then also the work we do. So specifically with certified access, we're on the ground. We see ourselves as the bridge, we've had a chance to get some seats at the table, but we're bringing the full force and voice of our community with us to drive change within. And so we're doing some work with a government entity, for example, Hennepin County, we're doing some work with them, and, we're bringing those voices to able to drive some policy change, to drive, process change. And so it's really informing everything, but not only are we doing it, we're also saying, hey, let's open the door to bring in more. It's not just about us, it's about continuing that process and creating an ecosystem that, is really nurturing this idea and this mission. And so, again, I really feel like we have the privilege to be able to live this and breathe this 100% of the time.
Absolutely. You all have been phenomenal. I want to say a big thank you to each one of you for this conversation, for not only today's conversation, but for the work that each one of you are doing inside your businesses and organizations every day to build anti-racist and equitable and inclusion places of belonging that not only impact your spheres, but also our entire economy every day, and for being willing to share what you're doing with our audience and with the Center for Economic Inclusion in Solidarity. A big thank you. I want to say a big thank you to our audience for engaging with us today and for living out these values in your spheres of influence and impact as well every day, for reckoning to rise together with us once again. And I want to invite you to stay till the very end so that you can take our survey and give us feedback, not only about today, but about what you want to see us engage with in the future, because we listen to you, and that's how we shape this agenda for the future. I want to invite you all to join us for our next series, next session in this series next month on November 11th. We will be reckoning to rise together, focused on equity and inclusion in the media and how we continue to change the narrative by ensuring that there are investments happening in those media outlets that come directly from our community, so that the stories are told in the voices that represent our communities and what can happen through those investments. We thank you for all that you've invested with us and for working in solidarity with us. We thank you for the ways that you lead, because it matters. Continue to reckon to rise with us. Thank you. Please take our survey and give us feedback.